The crucifixion of Jesus wasn't as bad as it's been painted. All things considered, he got off pretty lightly. If the New Testament account is to be believed, it took him just hours to die, whereas a lot of those killed by this hideous mode of execution thrashed around on their crosses for days. Perhaps Jesus' earlier scourging at the hands of the Romans helped him on his way. He would have shed a lot of blood from those wicked iron-tipped whips, which would make death by crucifixion rather quicker. The scourging was probably a blessing in disguise. This isn't the kind of stuff I was taught at my Catholic school. On the contrary, we were encouraged to feel as morbid as we could about Christ's suffering. We were even supposed to believe, absurdly, that his crucifixion was the most excruciating form of torment any human being had ever endured, perhaps because he was divine, and therefore more sensitive to pain than mere mortals. Gods are also, presumably, more resistant to aspirin. Christianity, in the distorted version of it I picked up at school, seemed to be a kind of death cult, full of festering wounds and hearts spouting blood. One gathered the impression that there was something spiritually ennobling about being sick, afflicted, or driven half out of your mind by torture. This may have been the opinion of some of the religious brothers who taught me, who inflicted a fair amount of suffering themselves, but it wasn't, for the record, Jesus' own view. He spends a lot of time in the Gospels curing the sick and disabled, but he never once urges them to be reconciled to their illness. On the contrary, he seems to regard suffering as evil, and at one point even refers to it as the work of Satan. The diseased and disabled are prevented from taking their full part in the human community, and Jesus' aim is to restore them to their full humanity by returning them to the friendship and fellowship of society at large. The gift he has to bestow is what he calls abundance of life, not a ghoulish fixation on death. Let the dead bury their own dead, he brusquely informs his disciples, a sentiment that the Jews of the time, for whom burial was a sacred duty and unburied corpses an unthinkable scandal, would have found outrageously offensive. It's in keeping with this zest for life that Jesus isn't presented by the New Testament as an ascetic, life-denying figure. There's nothing of the Puritan about him. On the contrary, there are whispered accusations that he and his comrades are drunkards and gluttons. The morality he preaches is reckless, extravagant, over the top. Give away your cloak as well as your coat, turn the other cheek, love those who insult you, walk an extra mile. It's not the kind of ethics one associates with chief executives or chartered accountants. He's pretty laid back about sex as well. In fact, the Gospels have hardly anything to say on the subject, unlike millions of those who follow Christ today, who can talk about hardly anything else. So if Jesus is such a life-affirming character, why is there so much death and agony in his story? Well, it's clear to begin with that Jesus doesn't want to die. He doesn't seem to have been a masochist or a madman. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he prays for his torture and execution to be called off, he's obviously panicking badly. He dies because the only way to the new life he proclaims is through a suffering solidarity with the poor, outcast and dispossessed, a solidarity which he practices in his life and which achieves its symbolic climax in his death as a reviled political criminal. Only by divesting yourself of yourself can you come into your own. If you don't die to the kind of squalid power setup which did Jesus to death, you can't rise again. Eternal life, which is to say, life at its most fully, richly, exuberantly human, is possible, all right, but it comes at a dauntingly high price. It won't come about simply by a series of reforms or piecemeal improvements, or by tossing a few pence in the direction of your favourite charity. As Jesus warns, you can't pour new wine into old bottles. The transformation he calls for is one that cuts much deeper than this. It has to, given the lamentable state of the world. It's about the coming of what Jesus calls the kingdom, and you'll know that the kingdom is at hand when, in St. Luke's words, you see the hungry being filled with good things and the rich sent empty away. To achieve the new life of human justice and fellowship, then, you have to pass through death and dispossession. You have to take on sickness and torment, madness and futility, oppression and exploitation, in order to transform them. If you simply leave these things behind you, nothing can be redeemed. As the art of tragedy knows, only by embracing the worst can you struggle through to something better. This doctrine, incidentally, is known as realism, not pessimism. So self-denial for the Christian gospel isn't an end in itself. What is an end in itself is self-fulfillment, which reaches its deepest reality in love. It's just that, given the atrocious state of the world, self-fulfillment must actually involve self-denial. It isn't a good thing that this is so. In fact, it's tragic. This isn't the way things were meant to be. Would that we could all achieve justice and friendship spontaneously, without having to die to our greed, envy, violence, possessiveness, and urge to dominate. This is the state of affairs known to Christianity as original sin. It's because of this dire condition that the transition from death to life, oppression to justice, agony to glory, is bound to be a turbulent one. It can't be a smooth evolution. It involves stripping ourselves of a lot we hold dear. This is why Christians speak of conversion rather than of gradually seeing the light. But this disinvestment of ourselves is done in the name of more abundant life, not as some sort of masochistic self-punishment. This is how it differs from Puritanism or nihilism. Nobody who thinks that things are basically okay with the human species can take this truth on board. Think of what one might typically call an enlightened or progressive outlook today, one which holds that there are, of course, various pockets of human misery here and there on the planet, but that basically history is on the way up. Despite the occasional setback, we're in progress towards a better world. Nobody who really held this view could understand what the crucifixion is about, because the image of the crucified Jesus is there to smash all such complacency. What it says, dismayingly, is that the truth of human history can be summed up in the mutilated corpse of one who spoke up for love and justice and was done to death by the state for his pains. Or at least, if you don't recognize that this is fundamentally the way things are, you'll never break through to anything better. In this sense, the New Testament is a brutal destroyer of human illusions. There's nothing in the least cosy, high-minded, or sentimental about this stark document. Instead, Jesus tells his followers that if they stay faithful to him, they'll meet the same sticky end as himself, and indeed, quite a few of them did, including one of his own brothers. How about that for the consolations of religion? If that's supposed to be escapism, give me Walt Disney any day. If self-denial isn't an end in itself for Christianity, neither is celibacy. Jesus was celibate probably because he believed that the kingdom of God was about to arrive at any moment, which left no time for marriages, mortgages, children, car washes, and other such suburban phenomena. Those of us who aren't expecting the kingdom to arrive next Wednesday are free to indulge in such pursuits. But this kind of celibacy isn't hostile to sexuality as such. On the contrary, when St. Paul comes to look for an image of the fellowship of the kingdom, he offers us the example of marriage. It's the sexual coupling of bodies which prefigures God's kingdom, not celibacy of the kind that Jesus seems to practice. Celibacy isn't an end in itself in the way that love is. Instead, it involves what the New Testament calls being a eunuch for the kingdom. Religious celibates are odd, quirky, out of line, but they're out of line for a purpose. As a child, I was encouraged, like many others, to give something up for Lent. What Jesus gave up for Lent was, of course, himself, the most radical form of self-denial one could conceive of. And this makes him what we call a martyr, which is Greek for witness. On the surface, martyrs look a bit like suicides. Both, after all, freely abandon their lives. But the suicide does so because his life has become utterly intolerable, whereas the martyr yields up his most precious possession. The suicide is glad to be rid of a worthless burden, while martyrs surrender the most valuable thing they have. They do so to bear witness to the fact that there's something even more valuable than their individual lives, and in some circumstances this thing is the lives of others. A lot of martyrs go to their death so that others may live, like the priest who took the place of a child in the queue for the Nazi gas chambers. Today, some people who call themselves martyrs, Islamic suicide bombers, don't die so that others may live, but die so that others may die too. If Jesus wanted to die, then he was just another suicide, and his death was as worthless and futile as that of a suicide bomber. Only those deaths which are acts of love can bear fruit in the lives of others. And the most alarming thing about Christianity is that this is exactly the kind of death to which we're all summoned. Those who think religion is a matter of consolation should ask themselves whether they'd be prepared to lay down their lives for a total stranger. Yet when Christians speak of imitating Christ, they mean imitating his death, not just his life, because his death summed up the meaning of his life. There isn't, however, much fear that this summons to death will embarrass us too much, since few people, including Christians themselves, take it seriously anymore. Christianity long ago shifted from the side of the poor and dispossessed to the cause of the rich and violent. These days, it's largely on the side of the political state, not on the side of those who are done to death by it. For most part, it's the creed of the eminently respectable, not of the riffraff who Jesus hung around with. It's horrified by the sight of a female breast, but nothing like as horrified by the obscene inequalities between rich and poor. By and large, it worships a God fashioned blasphemously in its own image and likeness, a suburban, clean-shaven, short-haired God, rather than the Yahweh of the Old Testament, who is homeless, faceless, stateless, and imageless, who prods you out of your comfortable existence into the trackless terrors of the desert, and who tells his people that their burnt offerings stink in his nostrils. It was this rather offensive deity that Jesus claimed as the source of his own life, which is perhaps why he was able to give himself up for Lent, though with a lot more trouble than those who try to give up smoking.
This week's Lent talk was written and presented by Professor Terry Eagleton and produced by Rosemary Dawson.